The invitation had arrived in blackened envelopes, sealed with wax stamped in a symbol no one recognized. An eye encircled by thorny vines. There were 5 in total. 1 for each of them. Anton, the confident yet skeptical leader. Mira, the puzzle-obsessed perfectionist. Rocco, the adrenaline junkie who never turned down a challenge. Alara, the quiet but intuitive one. And Casper, the laid-back joker who always found humor in the darkest situations. The invitation promised an escape room like no other. The puzzle of despair. A challenge meant to push boundaries. And they had all laughed about it over drinks, boasting how quickly they would crack the puzzles, how no game had ever stumped them. Anton had even mocked the fine print. Participants waive all liability, should accidents occur. They were eager, hungry for thrills. Now, standing in front of the decrepit building at the edge of town, all of them felt the first pang of unease. The exterior was decaying, like something forgotten by time, with ivy crawling up its cracked walls and windows clouded with dust. A dull flicker from a neon sign buzzed, but it was barely legible. Escape if you dare. This is the place? Casper snorted, though his usual bravado seemed forced. Looks like we're more likely to catch tetanus than have fun. Don't be a wuss, Rocco grinned. Let's do this. They walked inside. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the air grew heavier, like it had swallowed their voices. A tall man in a black suit and a grotesque mask, featureless except for 2 hollow eye holes, greeted them without words. His hand motioned toward a table where each of them was handed a waiver, long and filled with dense, incomprehensible text. Anton signed first, then the others, hesitating only briefly. The moment the last pen stroke hit the page, the door slammed behind them. A cold rush swept over the group, and the faintest scent of rot clung to the air. I guess they take the no backing out thing seriously, Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. Anton tried the door, but it was sealed. Click. The lights overhead buzzed and dimmed, casting the room in an eerie, sickly yellow hue. They were in what appeared to be a modest living room, a worn couch, a flickering TV showing static and faded family photos on the wall. Everything about the room felt wrong. The kind of wrong that crawls under your skin, a low hum of dread building in the back of your mind. Okay, let's figure this out. Mira clapped her hands, trying to break the tension. We've done harder rooms than this. Let's start looking for clues. They fanned out, searching under cushions, in drawers, even behind the crooked picture frames. Anton found the first clue. An old newspaper article describing a family's tragic death by carbon monoxide poisoning. The father's face in the photograph was scratched out. The mother's eyes gouged out with black ink. The children, 2 small girls, were missing entirely, leaving only ghostly outlines where they should have been. What the hell kind of theme is this? Anton muttered. Mira, too focused on the puzzle, pointed at a wall. There, numbers! Carved into the faded wallpaper were a series of numbers in jagged, uneven lines, as if scraped there by frantic hands. 1-3-9-2. Casper walked over to the wall and traced the numbers with his fingers. Easy. Probably for a lock or a safe. Found it, Rocco called, pulling a dusty box from under the couch. The lock on it was rusted, but it matched the numbers. He input the code, and with a creak, the box clicked open. Inside were 2 small items, an old key and a bloodied doll with one eye hanging loose from its socket. The hell? Rocco tossed the doll aside, its fragile porcelain head cracking as it hit the floor. Rocco, Alara hissed, don't just throw things. This place gives me the creeps. But before anyone could argue, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into pitch black. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the walls. The air turned colder, their breath fogging as the temperature plummeted. Anton reached for Mira's hand, but it was trembling, icy cold. He couldn't see her face, but he knew they were all scared now. A loud click, and the lights blinked back on, but the room had changed. The photos on the walls were no longer faded. They were now grotesque, showing mutilated bodies twisted in unnatural angles. Blood smeared across the walls where the wallpaper had been, and written in the smeared crimson was a message. One will not leave. What the fuck is going on? Casper's voice cracked, all traces of humor gone. Anton ran to the door they'd come through, but it wouldn't budge. We have to keep going. There's no other way. Shaken, they used the key to unlock the door to the next room, but dread clung to them like a second skin. The door led them into a child's bedroom, but it was far from innocent. Dark, grotesque drawings covered the walls. Crude crayon images of children with X's for eyes, lying in pools of red crayon blood. In the center of the room stood a clock, its hands ticking down from 60 minutes. A cold, metallic voice crackled through hidden speakers. You have 1 hour. Fail, and you will be punished. The clock will decide. Mira walked toward the bed, where a large box rested, surrounded by what appeared to be children's toys. She hesitated before lifting the lid, revealing a puzzle. The pieces were strange, wooden, painted red, and it seemed simple enough until they realized the pieces were shaped like human bones. No way. Alara backed away, shaking her head. I can't do this. None of us want to, Anton growled, but we don't have a choice. They started piecing the puzzle together, hands shaking as they placed each bone into the frame. It was slow, agonizing work, and with each piece, the temperature dropped further, their breath coming in misty clouds. Halfway through, the lights flickered again, and from the corner of the room came a scraping sound. Alara screamed as the clock hands suddenly sped up, cutting their remaining time in half. Move faster, Rocco shouted, grabbing pieces frantically. Mira, struggling to place the next piece, sliced her hand on a jagged edge. Blood poured from her palm, staining the puzzle pieces. Shit! Shit! Anton ripped off his jacket and pressed it to her wound. But as he did, the scraping sound grew louder, like nails on a chalkboard. Suddenly, Rocco froze. His eyes widened in terror, and when Anton turned to look, he saw why. Something was crawling out from beneath the bed, a pale, childlike figure, but its face was nothing more than a stretched canvas of skin. It had no eyes, no mouth, only a hollowed-out cavity where a face should be, and it was coming for them. Run! Anton screamed, but the thing was fast, its twisted limbs skittering across the floor as it lunged toward Casper. Before he could react, it wrapped its spindly arms around his throat, dragging him to the floor. Blood gushed from his mouth as he tried to scream, but the creature was relentless. In one swift motion, it tore his jaw clean off. The others bolted for the door, blood splattering their clothes as Casper's body was torn apart behind them. Anton could still hear the wet sounds of flesh being shredded as they slammed the door to the next room behind them, gasping for breath. They were down to 4. They barely caught their breath before the door to the next room clicked shut behind them, sealing them in. The silence was palpable, broken only by their ragged breathing and the faint, wet sound of blood dripping from Anton's hands where he'd gripped Casper's torn jaw. They were in a room designed to resemble a surgical theater, the kind used in the old days when people watched operations from a gallery above. Except this one had no observers, just them, and the blood-soaked horror waiting in the center of the room. On a cold steel table lay a mannequin, except it wasn't quite right. The limbs were unnervingly realistic, covered in patches of decayed skin, with sinew and muscle visible underneath. The face, pale and waxy, seemed to twitch as if struggling to come to life. Rocco was the first to step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This isn't real. It can't be. Mira's breath hitched in her throat, her injured hand trembling. It looks too real. Anton stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the surgical tools neatly arranged beside the mannequin. Scalpels, saws, clamps, all glistening with a fresh sheen of blood. We have to solve this one. We don't have time to think about it. Alara whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. What do we have to do? The answer came from the speakers above, the same voice as before. But this time it was colder, less mechanical. Assemble the body. Only when it is complete will you be allowed to leave. If you fail, you will join the collection. Anton swallowed hard and picked up one of the scalpels. We have to do it. We have to finish it. Mira reluctantly moved toward the table, but as she neared, she gagged. The stench hit them all at once, a sickening, rotting odor that clung to the back of their throats. She placed her hands on the mannequin's arm, and it felt disturbingly warm. Jesus Christ, Rocco muttered, backing away. It's real. It's not a mannequin. But there was no time to argue. The lights in the room dimmed, and a low growling noise rumbled through the walls, as if something monstrous was waiting in the shadows, hungry for failure. They began their grotesque task, each of them working frantically to piece together the body. The mannequin, or rather the corpse, was incomplete, missing several vital parts. The chest cavity was open, revealing ribs, but no heart. The left leg was severed just below the knee. They would have to find the missing pieces. Anton found the heart in a jar on a nearby shelf. It was submerged in some kind of thick, viscous liquid, still faintly pulsing as if it were alive. With a grimace, he reached in and pulled it out, the flesh soft and wet in his hands. Mira brought over a needle and thread, her fingers shaking as she prepared to stitch it into place. But as she bent over the body, the eyes of the corpse snapped open. Mira screamed, stumbling backward, dropping the needle as the corpse's jaw creaked open, issuing a long, rattling gasp, as though it were taking its first breath in years. "We need to finish this now," Anton shouted, grabbing the scalpel and cutting into the body's chest, trying to make room for the heart. Blood oozed out, thick and dark, pooling around their hands. It smelled like death. Alara backed into a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't do this. We're going to die here. We're all going to die." Rocco, pale and sweating, forced himself to help, his hands slippery with gore as he tried to attach the leg, but the flesh didn't fit. The pieces weren't just dismembered, they were mutilated, mismatched parts from different bodies. "I don't care if it doesn't fit," Anton growled. "We're almost out of time." The growling grew louder, the walls vibrating with the intensity of it, as if the very room itself was alive. Watching, waiting for them to fail. Rocco worked faster, his hands trembling as he jammed the leg into place. The body twitched violently as he forced the bones together, the sinews tearing as blood sprayed across the table. Suddenly, the surgical lights above them flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Snap, snap. The sound of bones breaking filled the air. Anton's heart raced as he fumbled for a flashlight. But before he could find one, he heard Rocco let out a bone-chilling scream. The lights came back on, and Rocco was gone. Only his severed arm remained, lying limp on the floor, torn from the socket, blood still gushing from the wound. "Oh God, no," Alara whimpered, covering her mouth. Mira was sobbing now, her face smeared with tears and blood. "We need to finish it. We need to—" But the body on the table sat up, its head jerking unnaturally, limbs twitching as it began to move on its own. It let out a sickening, guttural growl, its mismatched parts shuddering with the effort. It turned its head toward them, eyeless sockets staring blankly. "Run!" Anton shouted. They bolted for the door, shoving it open just as the corpse lunged forward. Its twisted arms grabbed at Mira, tearing at her skin with jagged nails. She screamed as it ripped into her shoulder, flesh peeling away under its grip. Anton and Alara dragged her through the door, slamming it shut behind them, the sounds of Mira's agonized screams echoing in their ears. The three survivors stumbled into the next room, bloodied and gasping for air. Mira was barely holding on, her shoulder a mangled mess of blood and torn flesh. This room was unlike the others. It was stark, with nothing but a large mirror hanging on the wall, its surface smooth and pristine. The walls were bare, the floor cold and hard. There were no puzzles, no clues, just the mirror. I can't take this anymore," Mira sobbed, sinking to the floor, clutching her injured shoulder. Anton knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. "We'll get out of here. We have to." Alara, her eyes wide with panic, stared at the mirror. "There's something wrong with this room. I can feel it." Anton stood up, glaring at the reflection in the mirror. But something was off. In the reflection, they didn't look like themselves. Anton's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Alara's skin was pale, her lips cracked and bleeding. And Mira's reflection was already dead, her body limp, eyes wide open, staring into nothing. "Jesus," Anton whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real. It's not real." But the reflection didn't move with them. It stayed frozen, showing a future that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it was happening. The room grew colder, the mirror's surface warping, as if the glass were bending inward, sucking them in. Their reflections distorted further, becoming grotesque versions of themselves. Anton's reflection began to rot, skin peeling away, revealing muscle and bone beneath. Alara's eyes melted, black liquid pouring down her cheeks like tar. Mira's reflection, still dead, smiled. Before they could react, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outwards, sharp shards slicing through the air. Anton shielded his face, but the others weren't as lucky. Alara screamed as a shard pierced her leg, blood spurting from the wound. Mira, already too weak to move, collapsed completely, her body convulsing in the pool of her own blood. Anton tried to pull Mira up, but her body went limp. She was gone. The door creaked open behind them, leading to the final room. Anton, drenched in blood, most of it not his own, looked back at Alara. Her eyes were glazed with fear, her leg pouring blood. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Together, they limped toward the door, leaving behind the shattered mirror and the bodies of their friends. Anton and Alara staggered through the open door, leaving behind the broken remnants of Mira's body. Blood dripped from Anton's torn clothes, his hands slick with it. Alara could barely walk, her legs shredded from the shard, each step leaving a trail of crimson. They stumbled into what appeared to be the last room. It was stark, empty, with no ominous decor or twisted theme like the previous ones. The walls were bare concrete, damp and cold to the touch. In the center of the room stood a single metal chair and a large red button mounted on a podium next to it. The air felt still, suffocating, as if waiting for them to make their next move. Alara slumped against the wall, barely able to stay upright. Her face was pale, eyes glassy with shock. "I can't do this anymore, Anton. I can't. We're all going to die in here." Anton wasn't sure what to say. His mind was numb from the horrors they'd seen. The sight of Rocco's arm, severed and bloody, and Mira's lifeless body still lingered, burned into his memory. Every breath felt like it was choking him. The speakers crackled to life, and that same cold, metallic voice filled the room. "The final puzzle awaits. One of you must sit in the chair and press the button. The person who does will die. The others will be allowed to leave. Make your choice." The words hit them like a punch in the gut. Anton felt his stomach drop, bile rising in his throat. One of them had to die? After everything, it came down to this. Alara shook her head, her lips trembling. No, we can't. There has to be another way." But the door behind them had already closed, the lock clicking into place. They were trapped. This was it, the final challenge. Anton's eyes flicked to the chair, to the button. Simple. Deadly. The room grew colder, a biting chill creeping through the air, as if the very room itself was watching, waiting for them to make their fatal decision. Alara's voice broke the silence. "Anton, you're the strongest. You should be the one to survive." "I can't do it." Tears welled in her eyes, streaking her blood-stained face. Anton swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He looked at Alara, her leg mangled and bleeding, her body fragile. He had to make a choice, but his mind was racing, and fear was gnawing at him from all sides. Before he could answer, the walls of the room began to vibrate, a low rumble that set his teeth on edge. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of impending death. The floor beneath them shifted, groaning as if something immense was lurking just below, waiting for them to fail. Time was running out. They couldn't stall any longer. "God damn it, Alara!" Anton snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I don't know if I can—" She interrupted, her voice broken and desperate. "If you don't, then we both die here. Is that what you want?" Anton clenched his fists, his knuckles white. She was right, and he hated it. There was no time for second-guessing or trying to figure out another way. The room had no hidden clues, no trick solutions. It was forcing them into the ultimate decision. One life for another. Suddenly, the cold voice from the speakers returned. 5 minutes remain. If a choice is not made, both will die. The temperature plummeted again, and the lights in the room dimmed, casting eerie shadows across the bare walls. Anton's heart raced, pounding in his ears. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the room began to close in around him. He could hear his pulse, feel the blood thrumming in his veins as if the whole world had narrowed down to this one terrible moment. Alara pushed herself off the wall, limping toward the chair. Her eyes were distant, lost in the agony of knowing what had to be done. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll sit in the chair. Just promise me you'll get out. Promise me you'll survive." "No," Anton said sharply, grabbing her arm. "You don't have to." She yanked her arm free. "Yes, I do. You have a better chance out there. I can't even walk right. I'm slowing you down. It's me. It has to be." Before Anton could stop her, Alara limped over to the chair and sat down. Her body trembled, blood still trickling down her leg, pooling beneath her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears and terror, and reached out for the button. Her hand hovered over it, shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Anton felt like the world had collapsed around him. His chest tightened, and he couldn't breathe. He wanted to stop her, to pull her out of the chair, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The rumble beneath the floor grew louder, the walls groaning as if they were about to cave in. Alara pressed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. The room was silent, and then her body convulsed, violently jerking in the chair as electricity surged through her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror, as her body twisted and arched, muscles seizing under the shock. Blood burst from her nose, her ears, even her eyes, pooling in her lap as her skin turned a sickening shade of gray. Anton could only watch in horror as her body continued to spasm, the stench of burnt flesh filling the air. Her nails dug into the arms of the chair, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Then, with one final convulsion, her head slumped forward, and she went still. The button clicked, and the door to the outside world opened with a soft whoosh. Anton stood there, frozen, staring at Alara's lifeless body. The silence in the room was deafening, except for the faint hum of the speaker above him. He couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his heart still racing as if it hadn't caught up with what just happened. She was gone. She had given herself up so he could live. Slowly, Anton approached the door, his eyes never leaving Alara's body. The cold air from outside rushed in, stinging his skin, but he felt nothing. He stepped through the door, blood still dripping from his hands, his face pale and hollow. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a dull light over the gray, decaying building. The world outside looked the same as it always had, but nothing felt real anymore. Anton turned around, staring at the door he had just walked through. For a moment, he thought he saw something move inside. Alara's body? No. It had to be his imagination. He backed away, his legs unsteady, before turning toward the empty street ahead of him. Weeks passed. Anton hadn't been the same since he left that cursed building. He could still feel the blood on his hands, the smell of burning flesh in his nostrils. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what had happened. How could he? No one would believe him. Then one evening, as he sat in his dingy apartment, the mail arrived. Nestled among the bills and junk flyers was a small black envelope, sealed with the same wax stamp from before. The eye surrounded by thorny vines. Anton's hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single card, embossed with gold lettering. "Congratulations on surviving. We look forward to your return." His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. They weren't done with him. And this time, they wouldn't let him escape.